Films. They have become one of the largest industries in the world, reaching almost every corner of the planet and raking in billions every year. From great films to mediocre films and whatever the heck this was.
It's New Dawn again?
Films have forged for themselves an almost unrivalled place in culture. They become a means of escape, a retreat from reality, a means by which to engage with far-off worlds, distant countries, or unknown people. A medium through which people can reach out and vicariously touch the past. And since film's inception, history has been a constant and continual subject. Films have increasingly become the main way in which the public discover and engage with the past. People's views of wars, events, figures, and situations are constructed for them by the films they have seen. This is no more obvious than in the treatment of the First World War. The view of the war has always been shaped by the predominant literary or art medium of the time, and in the 21st century, film has risen to the forefront. The way the public interpret the war, the way they view people, events, and circumstances, the way they feel about the First World War is forged by the films they watch and the characters they connect with. It's Armageddon presented through the lens, and people are beginning to know nothing else. The First World War broke out on August the 4th, 1914, and for Britain, the public interpretation of and feeling towards the war was shaped by the predominant mediums of literature and art. The government needed to try and justify their decision to get involved in the war, and the most popular art forms leapt to their aid. The poems of Jesse Pope implored the British man to stand like St. George and fight the evil onslaught of German brutality. And the writings of Rupert Brooke championed the patriotic nationalism that typified so many of the early volunteer responses.
If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England.
The British public responded to this, enthusiastically supporting the war effort, pushing their fathers, sons, brothers, lovers, and friends to join up and serve their country. The British government understood the power of literature and art, and used it to try and shape public opinion. As early as September 1914, well-renowned authors such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, Lawrence Binyon, and Florence Barclay agreed to pen works to help fuel and promote the government's propaganda. As the war began to sink into a stalemate, and the home front became increasingly aware of letters and poems being written by the soldiers at the front, public opinion began to turn against the war effort. Everyone began to realize it wouldn't be over by Christmas, and that it was a lot less glorious and idealistic as they had first thought. The literature had become a lot darker, a lot more sorrowful, gory, and explicit. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Ivor Gurney, and Edmund Blunden, amongst others, wrestled with the futility of war and the moral complexities and perplexities of their service. Rupert Brooke's resounding patriotism found in "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England," began to be looked at as an idealistic, foolish, naive sentiment in the face of the brutality and carnage described by Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est.
My friend, you would not tell with such high zest
to children, ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Or Siegfried Sassoon's haunting suicide in the trenches.
I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled with the early lark. In winter trenches cowed and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads mark by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
To combat this downturn in public opinion, John Buchan, the author behind the wildly popular The 39 Steps, was appointed director of a new Department of Information in 1917, and produced 2 sequels to The 39 Steps that worked to help shape public opinion as it waned. For many of those on the home front, the only way in which they could engage with the war was from the literature produced about it. Poetry, novels, articles, letters, stories, songs and paintings became some of the predominant ways through which the British people interpreted the war. Cinema and short films had been around since the late 1890s, but the British government saw little place for films at the beginning of the war effort, and viewed the cinema as more of an indulgence than as a useful tool to promote the war. It wasn't until the middle of the war that films began to have a major impact on the public view of the war effort. The War Office released a film in 1916 entitled The Battle of the Somme, which, along with the classic reels of young men smiling and excited to go to battle, they also included extended scenes of battle footage, capturing casualties, prisoners, and violence. The Somme broke the box office, with the public finally getting to see the realities of war for the first time. They were suitably shocked and traumatized. As the government began to see the power of films, they created the War Office Cinematography Committee and began to produce films to show the true reality of the war. They made documentaries depicting the truth of the war effort, but the effect was far from desired. It began to eat away at morale, serving to exhaust the audience, forcing them to experience the trauma and violence of the war in a new, visceral, powerful way. They couldn't connect with the documentaries, preferring to watch narrative films that could draw them in and make them part of the drama. The committee embarked on the production of a film entitled Hearts of the World, the Story of a Village, which told the story of a small French village from the beginning of the war until the final shot was fired. It was released just before armistice, meaning that its propagandist effect is unknown. Whether or not it would have encouraged and emboldened a war-weary nation, no one will ever know. As the war ended, disillusionment began to eat away at the fervour of post-war celebrations. Literature began to deal with the physical, psychological, and emotional consequences of the war. The honourable, glorious, and heroic hue of the war was beginning to fade, and disenchantment began to set in. As C.E. Montagu wrote in 1922, typifying much of the post-war mood, "Glad as we all were to be done with the war, its end left even the strongest of us a little let down." Throughout the interwar years, the events of the First World War became the subject of more than 30 major feature films by British studios. As Matthew Paris has argued, these films largely presented the war as heroic and positive, while not denying or shying away from the appalling conditions, the suffering, and the casualties. Films like Armageddon of 1923 chronicled the story of Britain's first real success in the war, in which they defeated the Turks during their Palestine campaign. Or Forever England of 1935 that highlighted the justifications behind the war and the dutiful service of the British soldiers. The popularity of these films is a testament to just how large of a role they played in the way the public interacted with the war and interpreted it. They also served as a kind of commemoration, helping grieving families come to terms with their loss by allowing them to believe, once again, that their family members' sacrifice had not been in vain. Once again, films were being used to try and shape the cultural narrative. The exact same message that had been portrayed at the beginning of the war began to make a comeback. The war as heroic, justified, righteous and moral began to become the predominant narrative of the war, with thanks to the work of filmmakers, writers and directors. It wasn't until the 1960s that this narrative really began to shift. As Brian Bond outlines, the 1960s was a formative decade for the understanding and interpretation of the war. With the rise of a more liberal youth culture and politics, the increasing separation between the present generations and the generations who had served in or had been directly affected by the First World War, the threat of an all-out nuclear war, and the declining national significance of Armistice Day, the national discourse surrounding the war became dominated by a new narrative: lions led by donkeys, and the futility of war. In the light of the Second World War, a seemingly clear-cut battle between good and evil, the First World War began to be seen as a rather more pointless, potentially meaningless struggle Britain really had no legitimate reason to have entered in the first place. The incompetence of the generals, the tragic loss of Britain's helpless, naive, plucky, promising young men, the seemingly inconsequential territorial gains, and the horror of the trenches were all emphasised to a greater extent than ever before. This is most vividly illustrated in the cultural phenomenon of Blackadder Goes Forth. In the final series of the BBC sitcom, the show presents the generals almost as caricatures of themselves, completely inept, dangerously incompetent, and ultimately, fatally wrong.
Exactly! And that is what is so brilliant about it. It will catch the watchful Hun totally off guard. Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time.
This has become a pervasive view in British society, with Max Hastings calling the predominant British narrative of the war the Blackadder take on history. This has become a cultural staple in the British public's understanding of the First World War, something reflected in many modern films. The 2017 version of Journey's End, in which all the characters die in the final moments. The 2012 adaptation of Michael Morpurgo's Private Peaceful, in which one of the protagonists is executed for trying to save his wounded brother in no man's land, having disobeyed an order. The moving 2014 version of Vera Britton's renowned novel Testament of Youth, in which all the young men around Vera are killed, and she is left with nothing, becoming a pacifist, unable to enjoy the armistice celebrations.
I held his hand as he was dying. He cried out for a woman he loved. He faced the end of his life by asking her forgiveness. I lost a brother in the war. And my fiancé.
The films about the First World War, produced since the 1960s, have largely followed a similar narrative. They present the war as brutal, hellish, with plucky, optimistic, patriotic young men caught up in the idealistic ideas of honour, glory, patriotism and duty, being marched obediently to their deaths, led by incompetent donkeys. With the rise of technology and a decrease in attention spans, there has been a decline in reading, and films have overtaken literature as one of the foremost means by which people engage with the past. Where once people could vicariously touch the past through All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque, or Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, one might be hard-pressed to find someone who has actually read either of them in recent years, especially in the younger generations. As a testament of this, one might find that it is the film adaptations of Journey's End, or A Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain, rather than the play or the novel, respectively, that the public know. Even video games have overtaken literature as a young person's primary contact with the past. Works previously considered memoirs, autobiographies, primary sources, or first-hand accounts are now more readily engaged with through a version in the cinema, tinged with whatever agenda, circumstance, or personal beliefs of the director, writers, or studio. It is through the camera's lens that most people now engage with the past. Oftentimes, people's views, understandings, and interpretations of the past are constructed by these films. For many people, films are the only means by which they engage with the First World War. The majority of young people don't voluntarily read history books, and only experience history in uninspiring school classes or through video games and films. Their entire understanding of the war is constructed by the films they watch. They may understand that the trenches were brutal, hellish, and catastrophic, but not because they read eyewitness accounts or even poetry, but because Lance Corporal Schofield had a hand sink into the rotted corpse of a dead German soldier in 1917, or Joey had to endure the exhaustion and eventual death of Topthorne as they struggle to haul a massive artillery gun up a hill in Warhorse. While the presentation of the Great War in film is not always incorrect or wrong, it can tend to overemphasize certain elements, serving to perpetuate a narrative and understanding of the war that feeds misconceptions and misunderstandings. The idea that the war was futile, potentially meaningless, and the deaths of millions of men was somehow a waste is a consistent idea perpetuated in most First World War films. While this may be true, and that's a different topic for a different video, it was not the way the soldiers viewed the war, and to overemphasize the futility of war is to undermine the sacrifice of those men, whether you believe in the cause or not. It is not about glorifying the dead, nor justifying their cause, but to characterize every general and every officer as either incompetent or heartless doesn't do justice to the men, young and old, who fought and died at the front. To overemphasize the pointlessness of the war and the potential illegitimacy of British involvement can lean towards devaluing and mocking a belief that hundreds of thousands of British men died for. No one will ever make the perfect First World War film, because that is way too subjective and way too much to hope for. But as time moves on, sensitivities, sensibilities, and agendas change, technology progresses, and more information is found, I can always hold out hope that someone will finally make a 2.5 hour long film of soldiers sitting in the trenches doing absolutely nothing as the stalemate took hold. But maybe that's just me.